Welcome to the third session of the 10th Roundtable on Financing Water on the topic Leveraging Private Finance for Water in Africa. It's a great pleasure to be here in Abidjan to moderate this session at the regional meeting on Africa of the Roundtable. We have collaborated very well with the African Development Bank to organize this meeting since several months, so we are very happy that this is materializing. So I'm very pleased to moderate this panel as there are excellent panelists with very diverse backgrounds, government representatives, DFIs, private investors, sovereign funds, and so on. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that the meeting is recorded. The video recordings will be available on the event webpage just after the meeting. Participants in the room will be able to take the floor to ask questions in the second part of the session. Participants online will be able to ask questions via the Q&A function. So let me now start the session with a few words of introduction. So leveraging private finance for water in Africa is an issue that came strongly this morning during the opening, session 1, session 2, with the idea that public sources alone cannot close the financing gap for water. While the main sources of finance for water in Africa are likely to remain public and concessional financing, there is potential to mobilize private capital for water in Africa more effectively. Investment in water has historically been mostly financed by public budgets, including international transfers with contribution users via tariffs, abstraction charges, and other economic instruments. Blended finance, public-private partnerships, private equity investment for water in Africa are emerging but have not reached scale. Strengthening the enabling environment, policies, regulations, institutional arrangements, and developing innovative financial arrangements aimed at diversifying sources of finance for water and mitigating risks represent opportunities to tap into private sources, be it users, industries, philanthropies, domestic commercial banks, and so on. But this raises a question: how can we ensure a fair distribution of risks and benefits between the public and private sectors? Approaches to mobilizing private capital may be tailored to different types of water investments, as each subsector has a different risk-return profile and a distinct maturity in terms of history of access to finance. So many solutions have been promoted for the past years. Innovative mechanisms, risk-sharing instruments, policies, regulations. Yet the private sector is still not investing at scale in water in Africa. So what have been missing until now? How could that change? And what challenges and opportunities are specific to the African continent? So I'll start by introducing our first speaker, Fatoumata Sissoko-Sy, Manager Infrastructures and Natural Resources for West and Central Africa at the IFC. Fatoumata, my question to you is the following. How could DFIs more effectively leverage private capital for water? What can DFIs do a bit differently than the past year to be more effective in leveraging private finance for water? The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me at this panel. I will do my statement in English. Please bear with me for that. As you say now, we discussed largely this morning about the sense of urgency around this SDG 6 and bridging the financing gap. Preparing the panel, I went through some statistics. Obviously, I'm not going to share all of it with you guys because I guess you know most of them, but one of the statistics just strikes me. It's the amount of financing of investment that is needed by 2030. Water-related infrastructure investment needed by 2030 is $6.7 trillion US. $6.7 trillion US. That is absolutely phenomenal. And For that, I think this is where we talk about private sector, because bridging the gap will require coordinated action and massive increase in investment and financing flows throughout all the value chain of water. And I'm very happy to be here and having this conversation with the distinguished delegate on this panel. So how do we bridge the gap? How do we bridge this financing? Of course, as I say, collaborative, holistic approach, but we have to acknowledge our starting point. This morning, we had the intervention of Fatuma, manager at the World Bank, who also shared that today, the investment in the water sector from the private sources is 9%. 91% is still public financing. So before addressing specifically the question and then trying to maybe share some of our approaches, DFI's in general approaches, I want to emphasize maybe two constraints. The first one is the perception of water as a social good and a human right. Water as a resource, as we all know, is commonly taken for granted and sometimes wasted. So we talked this morning, I think, about value for money. Water has been undervalued by public and private players. And it's not, we talked about that also with the previous panelist, it's not sufficiently considered in the economic planning and the policy making of the country. And in most countries, so now we're talking about, I would say, financial equilibrium, the price of water will not reflect its real economic value, and the price will not even cover the cost of provision of the underlying services that are required to provide water. That's the first point. The second point I want to mention, we also touched base on that earlier this morning, is the institutional framework we are dealing with. It's oftenly, the players are oftenly decentralized at municipal level, at sub-sovereign level, which will result sometimes in atomized, please give me a signal if I'm reaching the 5 minutes, atomized institutional structure. So that kind of atomized structure requires also massive public financing. And on top of that, we also touch base about the environment, the sector, the private sector will have to play with. We talked about the fact that the private sector needs stability, visibility, transparency, predictability earlier this morning. And the current environment sometimes doesn't have those elements. And the high transaction cost, the back and forth, the endless discussion, mostly discourage the private sector players. So how can we do? How can we address those gaps? Of course, I think we can start making the statement that reaching out to a private sector could help in terms of improving the efficiency, the operational and the technical efficiency, while managing the water service provider. I'm thinking, for example, of SODECI here in Côte d'Ivoire, which will have a specific cahier des charges from the government of Côte d'Ivoire, and specific key performance indicators, KPIs, that will ensure alignment between the objective of the authorities and the objective of the private sector. Another approach would be in terms of structuring a project. You talked about mixing, sort of hybriding the private and the public resources. That is another way of doing it. We have worked on several projects at IFC where we mobilize public financing via what we call viability gap funding to enable affordable tariff for the end users being the household and the businesses. I wanted also to share one project that IFC worked on. It's on the advisory part of IFC. We have advisory services to advise the government in structuring PPP. It's in Kigali. It's a project, Kigali Bulk Water Supply Project, 40 million liters per day of clean water. And that project, they launched a tender process. It was won by a player called Metito, who has 60 plus experience in the water management. Just to give you a bit of insight about the structuring of this kind of transaction. So the total project cost was 60 million US dollar. 2/3 were financed by debt. 1/3 were financed by equity. And there were also a technical assistant facility from PIDG, which also helped to have a sustainable tariff at the end of the construction period when the water will be available to the population. So that is to go a bit into the structuring, but one other, I think, important approach we should have, because I mentioned 6.7 trillion, it's absolutely phenomenal. We have to have a structured approach that could be replicable and scalable. That is very important. I just want to mention and to quote the Minister of Water earlier this morning. He mentioned the IPP, independent power producer, and he was making a statement saying that now they want to do IWP, independent water producer. And on the IPP model, on the electricity sector, we worked on one project called Scaling Solar, which is a package, predefined package. We call it one-stop shop, with the pre-agreed documentation, with all the tools of the World Bank mobilized. When I say all the tools, I mean MIGA for providing guarantee to the equity. I mean IDA for providing concessional fund. I mean sometimes a guarantee from the government also to de-risk the project for the private sector. So that kind of scaling water, it was a scaling solar, but scaling water, I think could also be an interesting approach, and we are conducting that kind of approach in some country. And again, a bit of structuring. So we talked about credit enhancement, mixing resources, public, private resources, blended finance. All those are tools that will help de-risk the project and improve the creditworthiness of the utilities. Innovative model, innovative approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatoumata. Very interesting points on the perception of water as a social good and a human right, whereas it should be seen as a prerequisite for growth and economic development. Interesting as well, the idea that tariffs are far below cost recovery levels for the moment in Africa, and to address that, you implemented the viability gap funding mechanism. The point on the Kigali bulk water supply, I think Ernest Poku will go back to this example later, example of successful PPP in the water sector. And the point of the idea of IWPP on the model of the IPP model in the energy sector, so, and the scaling water on the model of scaling solar. So a lot of very concrete ideas, and that's what we need here to effectively contribute to increase investments in water in Africa. So thank you for these very concrete ideas. I'll now move on to our second panelist, Babacar Nin, who is Deputy CEO of the Fonds Souverain d'Investissement Stratégique, Fonds 6, au Sénégal. Dear Babacar, could you please share with us your vision of the role of sovereign investors in financing water in Africa, and particularly in mobilizing private capital for water? What can be changed? What solutions should be developed? The floor is yours, Babacar.
Thank you very much, Aude. Thank you for having me as a speaker in this very exciting panel. I would like to start by recalling the mission of Fonds 6. As a sovereign wealth fund, actually we are more a strategic development fund. And our core mission is to crowd in massive private investment in strategic sectors by co-investing with the private sector and rolling out innovative schemes regarding project funding. And as far as leveraging private financing is concerned for the water sector, I would like to focus on 3 areas of intervention and to elaborate a little bit more on that. The first one is project development and project preparation. Second one is co-investment with private sector through PPPs and joint venture. And third is to the recourse of blended finance as innovative tools to match the funding needs of the WASH sector, water and sanitation. So regarding the first area, project preparation and development. Actually, it's very important to have this capacity to translate ideas or concept of projects into a bankable project, appealing for the private sector. And to do that, we use equity monies, equity fund, our own equity funds, and all the activities will include feasibility studies, financial studies, environmental impact assessment, securing the land, and also obtaining permits and authorization required in order to make the project bankable regarding the legal framework applicable. It's very important for the private sector because when you do that, you give them visibility regarding the risk and return profile of the project. And number two, you give also to the private sector the key information they need in order to start the investment decision process. It is also important for the governments, for the sponsor of the project. For instance, for the complex projects or projects that require to have some strategic arbitration, having a good development phase or preparation phase help the government to design the relevant incentive packages that they will allocate to the project, or sometimes also to undertake some reforms at the sectoral level in order just to boost the bankability or the attractivity of these projects. For instance, in Senegal, we are currently working on what we call the first raw water transport pipeline project. It is 200 kilometers project, roughly 500 million USD. And this project will have huge impact because it will transport water from the lake and river regions to the most populated cities of the country. But beyond that, all the farmers that will be on the route of the pipeline will be supplied in raw water, which is more cost efficient, cost effective than the treated water they use from the tap. Number two is another project related to have a most cost-effective irrigation system. So we are working to replace the petrol-powered water pump or electrical water pump connected to the grid by solar water pumps, which is not only more cost-effective, but also which is eco-friendly. Number two is about co-investment and with the private sector in PPPs and joint venture. Investors, private investors especially, when they invest in a country, they will require to have not only bankable projects, but sometimes they would like to have relevant local partner who is not willing to share the risk, the investment risk, but also who has a deep knowledge of the business environment and who is also willing to share his knowledge of the business environment to help them to just deliver, implement the project as fast as possible. So that's why as a sovereign wealth fund, we have an equity investment activity where we can invest in implementation phase of projects with private sector. It can be through PPPs or joint ventures. And it has proven to be a very effective way to give comfort to the private sector just to step in and to invest in the project in a foreign country. But I would like also to, it is worth noting two key success factors in such scenario. First, you have to have a minority stakes and to let to the private sector the operational control of the project of the SPV so that they can be accountable of the operational performance. Number two is also to share our knowledge and as a sovereign wealth fund to act as an inflection point between the administration and the private sector. Sometimes it's to advocate for some incentives customized for the project. Sometimes it can be to advocate for some reforms of the government regarding the impact of the projects. For instance, currently, our leverage effect is 10, 1 out of 10. For each dollar we invest in a project, we raise $9 for the private sector. Because when we de-risk a project, we just have a minority stake but also we play an active role in the governance of the project to be sure that the interests are aligned between the parties. Number three is having recourse to blended finance to roll out innovative instruments that can be structural solution to match the financing need of the wash sector. What we have done so far is, I think the minister in his remark was talked about that. He highlighted the fact that we are in Senegal trying to create the Blue Fund. The idea is that to set up an equity investment fund with a target size of 1 billion USD. This fund will be used to finance projects in the wash sector, but also SMEs in the wash sector. Because for us, SMEs are very important, they are playing a vital role. We need to empower them. We need also to give them patient capital in order to fuel their development. The strategy is to start this Blue Fund with public money, money from the government's budget and funds, and then to raise money from the MDBs or DFIs, Development Financial Institutions, donors, but also impact investment fund. So that by doing that, we can have a real leverage, and also it can be a very effective tools to finance not only the projects that need to have equity in order to interest banks, but also the SMEs that we need to develop and to have locally an ecosystem of SMEs in all the wash sector. So in a nutshell, this is what we are trying to do in Senegal. What I can say so far is that it's not very easy to have commitment, strong commitment from the private sector, but it's possible. But it requires that the countries do their homework. I will finalize, I will close my remarks on one paradox. For instance, if you discuss with GFIs and people who have private investors or people who have capital, they will say that they have a lot of money, they just want to invest in projects with impact. And if you discuss with African governments, they will say that we have an infinite or an unlimited number of projects, but we do not find enough money to fund them. So this is a paradox. And the key to the answer to this paradox is maybe to capacity building to the countries, government, civil service agencies, to have the skills to develop projects, to prepare projects, and also to de-risk as far as possible projects in order to have investment opportunities bankable, appealing for the private sector, and by doing so, I think that it can help African countries to fill the gap we are observing now in the financing of the wash sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Babacar. Very interesting points on project development and preparation to give visibility to investors, on also developing joint ventures, PPP and SPVs, and on blended finance. I know that the Blue Fund in Senegal has been a project since several years, but it has not been operationalized. So if you could just, in one word, explain why it has not been operationalized until now and how it could be tomorrow operationalized. And as already Fonsis, did Fonsis took part in already joint ventures and SPVs in the water sector?
Thank you. I will start with the second question. Indeed, we have taken part in joint venture. For instance, the water distribution company in Senegal, in the urban areas, we are the second shareholder there, and we have helped since the tender process, working in collaboration with the ministry in charge of water and sanitation to just challenge the right partner and also to challenge his business plan, to challenge his the incentive he was requiring from the government. It's a contract of 15 years, but it has proven it's the first time that we have the sovereign fund who is a shareholder in this national company in charge of drinking water distribution. Number two, also currently we are working with another private company, global private company, that might be the company to invest in this big desalination plant of 300,000 cubic meters. France is also working to be a shareholder there in order just to help as his partner to de-risk his project, but also to lean on a local private partner who can help him go through the complexity of some procedure of the civil service. Now, regarding your first question related to the Blue Fund, Actually, what happened is Blue Fund is really a flagship project and is a paradigm shift in Senegal. Because for the last 20 years, I can say, or last 30 years, roughly all the projects was financed with public money, all the projects in the water sector. And with the Blue Fund, the idea is that to say to the government, look, instead of just every year putting on the table up to 200 million USD for some projects, and at the end of the day, it's not enough to find all the needs, but it is not also enough to have a leverage effect. So maybe what you can do is just to put this money on the basket and to ask to a fund manager, for instance, Francis, we have some knowledge and some skills in managing this kind of instrument, to go to see the private sectors, GFIs, donors, and to raise additional money, and to use this instrument not only to finance the projects that would be financed by the government based on the budget, but to structure the project, to have preparation phases of the project, and maybe to decrease the amount of public money you have to inject in the projects to maximize your leverage effect. This is the first goal. Second one is also to finance the SMEs. In Senegal, you have very, very little SMEs on the wash sector. And some of them are just subsidiary of foreign companies. So we need also to develop this ecosystem in the water supply, water sanitation, water recycling, and so on. But these SMEs, the banks are not just playing the game because it's quite risky. So you need to have these instruments that can give comfort to the bank to step in later on and to finance these SMEs, the growth of these SMEs. So this paradigm shift needed to have some discussions with the governments. It needed also to have some clear mandate, because what we have required is to all the government at a very high level to give a clear commitment that the government is on board on these flagship projects. They will support it, and they give a formal mandate to FONSIS, backed by all the ministries, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Water and Sanitation. And based on that, we can just go to start negotiations with potential investors in the fund, knowing that we have the full commitment of the government. And this process has taken a little bit time, but now it's okay. And while I was discussing, the ministry was just teasing me to say that he wants us to start the work on the ground, starting on next week.
Well, we look forward to the operationalization of the because it can be an example for other African countries, and also because, as the minister reminded this morning, at the 9th World Water Forum in Dakar, they launched the idea of a global blue fund. So if it works at national level, then maybe it can be scaled at global level. So thank you very much, Babacar Nin. So I would like now to invite Wanjiru Wataka, Regional Director for Africa of Incofin Investment Management, to take the floor on the following topic. Are there opportunities for private equity funds to invest in water in Africa? If so, how can we ensure that the investments go to projects that are beneficial to countries and societies? And could you please tell us more about the Water Access Acceleration Fund, which you have launched in New York, I think, and was it implemented in Africa, and how is it going? Wanjiru, please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Babaka has provided a good segue into my topic, because while he's left out with a paradox, I give an analogy. And I like to give this analogy that capital is like an aeroplane flying around in lack of a place to land. That's to say that there is no shortage of capital to put into bankable opportunities. And for me, that's one of the key challenges I find in, like, if I could speak from a private equity lens, there is not enough bankable opportunities. I think in the water space specifically, this is driven a lot by the return expectations, as usual. The typical returns in the water space, I would say, are sub your normal commercial returns. And as a result, maybe a lot of people then shy away from investing in the water space. However, in the last few years, I have had the privilege of speaking to a lot of entrepreneurs in the water space. We like to call them waterpreneurs. And they have 3 things in common. Number 1 is that they have a deep understanding of the problems that we face. They have lived experience. And as a result, they really do understand the solutions that are needed. That's to your question around how to ensure that the solutions fit the societies. I think a lot of them are actually coming from the people that have lived in these societies and have a deeper understanding of the problem. Number two, as I said, they have set up these businesses. As Babaka said, SMEs fixing this problem, sorry. So innovative solutions say around, one of the bigger problems when it comes to water service providers, for instance, is non-revenue water. The loss of water, they cannot bill. So such innovative solutions that play a part in ensuring that at least like a water service provider can then hopefully cover a lot more of their cost by limiting their losses. So that's one of the examples of the SMEs that we're working with. I think the other thing is that they get to a point as they scale their businesses that they're short of funding, as they all say. We've gotten to this stage, we require more funding, but nobody is willing to finance us. But then enters a fund like the Water Access Acceleration Fund. This is managed by an organization called Incofin Investment Management, and this is your typical blended finance private equity fund. We have some concessional funding from the likes of Danone, UK, USAID, DFC, EIB, that then come in and put in a sizable chunk of the money in the fund. But this allows us to then reach out to other commercial funders that then put in money into the fund. And in this way, we create like a bigger fund. And then now we're able to blend that return such that everybody gets the return that they anticipate. The beauty is, in the water space, you have a significant social return, and there are some players that are looking for that, and whereas you have the commercial players that are looking for the financial return, but you're able to blend it in one way or another. The challenge still remains in deployment. Opportunities are lacking, so it's good to hear countries like Senegal, which I've actually visited, and I actually have spoken to some entrepreneurs in that space who are working with the government, say in the rural areas, to ensure that the last mile water access is met. So those are really attractive opportunities for a private equity player. I think critical is in the structuring, because when I spoke to them, for instance, the duration of the project was a bit short, meaning players such as ourselves in the private equity space who have a life fund, we always typically have to exit, but if the period is so short, then it limits our ability to invest. I think those are some of the things that perhaps could be changed. I think as well from a fund perspective is that we need a lot more concessional funding to then be able to catalyze a lot more commercial capital, and that always will remain one of the impediments to setting up this fund at scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanjiro. So, if I understand well, the Water Access Acceleration Fund is at this phase of deployment, but you have no transaction in the water sector for now in Africa. Are you specifically targeting like specific countries or specific part of the water value chain where you see more opportunities? What's your strategy?
Well, the Water Access Acceleration Fund is actually an impact-first fund. We actually do have an impact target, and that is to distribute 20 billion liters of safely managed drinking water and reach about 30 million people over the life of that fund. That's very specific, very niche segment in the safe drinking water space, and that perhaps is the driver of the lack of opportunities. But that said, we have a rich pipeline. The challenge is that the transactions or the opportunities we're seeing are much smaller, but we're trying to also be creative and be a bit proactive. We do have what we call pre-investment technical assistance. So then we invest this even before we make our financial investment in the SME to then get them to a point that they are actually investable. So it's gotten to a point we actually have to do the work before the work. But it has been an interesting journey, and I think pipeline is looking rich. In regards to your countries, we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa generally. That's it, so quite broad. Any country with a bankable opportunity is a go for us.
Okay, very interesting, because I think it's the first private equity for drinking water in Africa.
Indeed.
Okay.
Globally,
So
actually.
Globally.
Yes.
We look forward to development, future developments. So I would like now to invite the Executive Director of Africa Water Infrastructure Development, Ernest Kofi Poku, to take the floor. Ernest, there are examples of successful public-private partnerships for water in Africa. Fatoumata mentioned one with in Rwanda. Do you think that these successful examples could pave the way for more PPPs for water in Africa, for instance, following the evolution of PPPs in the energy sector in Africa? And then how can we ensure that the risks and rewards are adequately shared between the public and the private sectors?
Thank you very much. I welcome the opportunity to be here and speak to you all today. It's my first time at the Roundtable, and I've learned a lot from meeting you all already, so that's been very nice. So I think the simple answer to the question is yes. The reason I'm here and the reason the organization I represent exists is because of the historical success of the Kigali water plant. So I'm the director now of the Africa Water Infrastructure Development Platform. It's only 6 months old. It's been set up by the world's largest desalination provider, Matito, a company based out of Dubai, and British International Investment. And the reason those two came together was because of the success of Kigali Water, which was developed by Matito a few years ago and has been operating for the last 2 years. And they believe that with a focused platform and the engineering expertise built in and the risk appetite and the appropriate risk allocation, that model could be replicated across the continent, both in North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the platform that's been put together that I lead includes two operating operations. One is the Kigali water plant, 40,000 cubic meters per day, as already discussed. But it also includes assets sitting in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is desalination water being provided into the local community and into hotels. And you may ask, why is that? And one of the reasons is that we see different models in the private sector being successful in different parts of Africa. So in North Africa, I spent a bit of time in North Africa the last few weeks, and we're seeing more B2B opportunities, more desal opportunities in North Africa, also a lot of very large-scale desal into agricultural opportunities. In Eastern Africa and the Western Africa, we're seeing more bulk and sanitation opportunities. And in Sub-Saharan in Southern Africa, we're seeing more sort of bulk transportation opportunities in terms of pipelines and that kind of thing. And why is that relevant? I think because what we're seeing is that the different parts of Africa have different levels of maturity in the bankability of the projects. As we all know, you can go into any town or village in Africa and there will be a need for water. So there's no question about the projects being out there. And then you say to yourself, well, what's the issue? Well, then you look at the financing side, and the people that are here and the money that's here indicates that there is appetite, and increasingly there's appetite to deploy financing into the water space. So what's lacking? And what the Matito and BI believed was lacking was a focused entity that would focus on the engineering and the risk appetite and the ability to operate these plants. So when I go to look at a new opportunity, I take my operating engineers out of Egypt or Rwanda, and we go into a country and we review the opportunities using people who are running plants on a day-to-day basis. So I have capital I can deploy on a risk basis to allow us to take a pile of pre-feasibility studies and actually develop them into a bankable project. And that's where we're focused, in that gap. Once we get it to bankability and financial close, yes, we will take equity in the project and we look to run it through to financial close, and then obviously into construction where Matito has the expertise, and then on to operations. But really my initial focus right now is, as I travel the continent, is identifying projects and working at an engineering level without charge. We do it on risk, and then the question then comes is, what are the risk allocation risks? And as I go around the continent, obviously we're seeing forex risks, particularly in the current climate. Forex risks are coming up much more. And the question then of the fiscal space in the countries to provide sovereign guarantees. I mean, I guess I say this from I come from power. I'm a power guy, really. And I see in power, sovereign guarantees have moved away, and we're moving into other forms of guarantees. And I think, as we've talked about, the amount of financing and capital that's required in Africa to do what we need to do will require some innovative thinking about how we back these projects, both from a lender point of view and the developer point of view. And I'd love to have that discussion with anyone who wants to have that discussion with me going forward about what are the mechanisms we really need. Because for me to go into a country and say I need a sovereign guarantee everywhere, it'd be nice, but I don't see us enabling us to develop the scale and speed that we need to develop these projects. So one of the reasons I'm here is I want to have that discussion and learn from people what the alternatives are to that. But once we identify what those alternative mechanisms are, and we cover forex risk, the risk allocation around who's carrying the risk around default, will be helpful. I think one example I would use is in Kigali. We have a very close relationship with WASAC, the utility. So we're selling the water at the factory gate effectively. The pipeline and the end user is managed by WASAC, the Kigali utility. And by having a very close relationship with them, we're able to work with them to make sure that the quality of water is what's required, not just for the end user, but one of the things that we've seen is that we're able to provide a quality of water that raises all the boats, in the sense that the quality of water we're providing is helping the other state-owned plants. And we're running more of the more complicated plants. We have boreholes. Most of the plants in Kigali, in fact all the plants in Kigali, are direct water abstraction. So we're able to provide a much more complicated plant and a level of water quality which enables everybody to benefit more broadly. And I think that's one way to look at PPPs in the water sector. It's not just the water that's going to provide everything. Not every new plant is going to be a PPP, as already discussed, but the quality and the expertise that comes from running that plant can be set as a benchmark for other plants, both in the country and in the region, and enable that learning more broadly.
Thank you, Ernest. And maybe on that question of sharing risks and benefits between public and private sectors. So how do you negotiate with governments? How do you make sure these projects are not only bankable, but they are beneficial for the countries? And how do you make sure that the risks and benefits are shared properly?
I guess ironically, sitting on the equity side, which is the side I've always sat on in my career, I find that our risk appetite is obviously way higher than the lenders. And I find that the risk allocation is driven more by the blended lender package than it is by the developer itself. Obviously, we can go in and say, yes, we have some tension around forex and making sure that we're able to cover both the capex and the opex, and that's where I see the most tension. But I think from the lender point of view, they want to make sure that the project, they have backup for their lending. And I think that's where we see the most tension, is on what guarantees are there to ensure that the lenders are going to get their money back, be that either guarantees from the utility, that non-revenue water is going to be not a problem, that there's enough money in a bank to cover these costs over the medium term. And I think that's where I see most of the tension. I don't see it at the equity level, at the developer level, to be honest with you. I see it at the lender level.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have one speaker online. Before that, I will invite Mr. Sylvain Migan, General Director of the Benin National Rural Water Supply Agency, to take the floor on the following topic: which enabling conditions, policies, regulation can governments put in place to effectively mobilize private capital for water in Africa, including commercial finance?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I think the audience will address in using French. That will be more comfortable for me to share the lesson we learned from what we did in Benin since 5 years ago. Donc, la question qui est posée, moi je ne vais pas revenir sur les instruments financiers. Donc, il est clair qu'aujourd'hui, le financement existe et que quelqu'un a parlé de devoirs de maison. Quels sont les devoirs de maison des pays? Donc, moi, je vais beaucoup plus insister sur ces devoirs de maison. Ce que nous sommes en train de faire au Bénin, et pour intégrer cette question, traduit la réponse que nous avons apportée au financement de l'approvisionnement en eau potable, en utilisant non seulement les fonds publics qui sont importants, mais en utilisant également le financement privé. Et ça part d'une vision. Et la vision du Bénin pour financer ce besoin important qui nous a permis aujourd'hui de partir d'un taux de desserte de 42%. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes pratiquement à 80% en 4 ans. Donc ça veut dire que la desserte a été couverte de façon violente ces 5 dernières années. mais en utilisant toutes les opportunités de financement qui existent, qu'ils soient financement public budgétaire, financement privé, mais financement également d'un instrument nouveau de la Banque mondiale qu'on appelle le Programme for Results. Et ça part d'une vision, et la vision est simple, c'est de fournir de l'eau potable à l'ensemble de la population avant le thème fixé par les Nations Unies qui est 2030, mais à des coûts qui n'excluent pas les pauvres, en incluant le secteur privé tout en maîtrisant les coûts. Donc c'est une équation à plusieurs inconnus. La première des choses qu'il faut faire, c'est la politique. Qu'un État doit faire, c'est d'avoir une vision politique. La vision politique du Bénin est basée sur 5 piliers. Le premier pilier, c'est la gouvernance du secteur avec des arrangements institutionnels. Je peux revenir là-dessus parce que dans la plupart des pays africains, on a hérité d'une situation où les gouvernements locaux sont responsables pour fournir l'eau potable. Mais les gouvernements locaux ne peuvent pas aller sur le marché financier. Donc, on a trouvé un accord avec l'ensemble des gouvernements locaux en signant des accords qui nous permettent de créer une agence que je dirige depuis pratiquement 5 ans, qui a pris le lead pour pouvoir avoir un programme d'investissement, une stratégie et une capacité de dialoguer avec le secteur financier pour pouvoir financer le programme d'investissement de façon massive comme je l'ai décrit. Le deuxième pilier de la stratégie, c'est le coût du service. C'est-à-dire le coût du service, qu'est-ce qui est contenu dans le coût du service pour que les populations puissent avoir accès à des tarifs qui ne les excluent pas. Le coût du service peut être défini à travers 5 choses. L'investissement en capital, ça c'est ce qu'on met au départ pour construire des équipements neufs. L'exploitation et la maintenance, le renouvellement à terme pour que quand les équipements arrivent à fin de vie, on puisse les renouveler. Et le quatrième élément, c'est le patrimoine. C'est-à-dire que pour faire fonctionner tout ça, il faudrait mettre de l'argent de côté. Et tout ça, c'est basé dans la tarification. Après, on peut parler de la tarification pour exclure ce que l'État peut prendre en charge et quand même préserver l'intérêt de l'opérateur privé qu'on apporte dans la délivrance du service. Ça, c'est le deuxième pilier, c'est le coût du service. Troisième pilier, c'est le modèle de délivrance. Comment on délivre le service? Avec le public ou bien avec le privé? Le choix a été clair, c'est le privé. Et comment on ramène le privé pour financer, gérer des équipements pour fournir du service? C'est à travers des contrats PPP. Et ces contrats PPP, je vais revenir là-dessus par la suite. Et ensuite, le dernier pilier, c'est le renforcement de capacité. Le cinquième pilier, renforcer les capacités des gens à gérer un système aussi complexe avec cette vision. Donc, c'est ce travail que nous avons eu à faire et qui nous permet donc d'asseoir le développement du service sur ces 5 piliers. Donc, c'est le travail de maison. Et l'une des conditions essentielles pour que ces choses marchent, à part la vision politique, c'est essentiellement la réglementation. Parce que vous ne pouvez pas, avec tous les instruments financiers que moi j'ai écoutés cet après-midi, vous ne pouvez pas attirer le privé si vous n'avez pas un cadre fiscal clair et un cadre juridique clair. Il faut avoir une loi PPP qui définit très clairement les obligations et les conditions dans lesquelles le privé peut avoir de la confiance pour pouvoir s'installer dans un pays. Donc quand il n'y a pas une réglementation de comment on peut faire appel à un privé pour gérer ou financer des équipements pour garantir un service public, il y a beau y avoir des instruments de financement, il n'y a pas de base juridique ou de base fiscale pour pouvoir attirer le privé. Donc ça, c'est la responsabilité de l'État. Ensuite, à part la loi, il faut aussi, en troisième condition, faire appel à un autre principe, à une autre condition qui est essentielle, qui est, comment je vais le résumer, c'est la disposition institutionnelle, comme je l'ai dit. Avoir une agence ou bien une institution qui sera l'autorité contractante du privé qu'on fait intervenir dans un pays, c'est essentiel. S'il n'y a pas un interlocuteur qui puisse être une autorité contractante sûre pour que le privé, en signant des contrats, saura que l'institution a une signature et s'engager sur le thème sur 10 ans de contrat, ce serait aussi très difficile. C'est un sujet aussi complexe, à part l'institution autorité contractante, il faut aussi gérer les disputes, il peut y avoir des conflits. Est-ce qu'il y a un comité PPP dans le pays? Est-ce qu'il y a des gens capables de se prononcer sur un modèle financier, se prononcer sur la durabilité de la tarification, calculer des choses très simples telles que une révision de prix d'un contrat? Donc, si au plan institutionnel, on ne prend pas cette disposition pour avoir une organisation institutionnelle dans un pays, pour avoir une autorité contractante claire, un comité PPP ou des gens capables de jouer le rôle de régulateur, de se prononcer sur des sujets très complexes, très tôt, le privé qui arrive à rentrer dans des situations de dispute, ça peut créer tout un tas de problèmes. Donc, je pense que je peux m'arrêter sur ces éléments. On peut, dans la discussion, se prononcer sur les autres. Mais ça veut dire qu'au niveau politique et au niveau de la régulation et de la réglementation, au niveau des dispositions institutionnelles, les États doivent créer des conditions favorables pour que, en dépit de l'existence des instruments financiers, le privé puisse être en confort pour venir donc intervenir dans le secteur. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Sylvain, for this on the role of governments to make sure that investors feel comfortable in investing in the country and particularly in water through clear visibility in terms of projects, water projects, so long-term project pipeline, but also clear visibility in terms of regulation, for instance, a clear PPP law and how conflict can be managed. So very interesting position on the role of governments. I have a last speaker who is online. Slav Gachev is leading the Sustainable Debt Team of the Nature Conservancy, which deploys nature bonds projects to mobilize capital for marine, terrestrial, freshwater conservation and climate in global emerging markets and in Africa. So Slav, many African countries are constrained in their investments in water because of their high debt burden. What financing mechanisms can enable them to free up budgetary space for finance water in Africa, and particularly to mitigate risks so private investors come in the sector?
Thank you very much, Odd, and it's a pleasure to be with you all virtually from Washington, D.C. I hope you hear me well. A regional managing director, Ademola, was looking forward to be with you in person, but a force majeure circumstance prevented him from being there, so I'm stepping in for him. But also to make sure that I give a plug for another colleague who is there in the room with you, Fred Kihara, who will speak tomorrow on another very powerful TNC strategy for Africa that we call water funds. And so he will be speaking at the 10 a.m. session tomorrow. So please make sure you attend that. Yeah, I will walk you through our nature bonds strategy, and just to make sure, I prepared a few slides that can illustrate my points. If those slides are available, please share them. If not, I will speak without slides and answer questions, and we can distribute those slides later. So let me know how you wish to proceed, Odd.
I think technical services have your slides, but you could also share them if you have them.
So I can't share slides on my end as that functionality is disabled. So in the interest of time, I will proceed without slides, and then perhaps there is a way to distribute those to the participants.
Yeah, perfect.
Since the prior speaker spoke without slides, I take that as a helpful challenge. Indeed, your question is a very good one, and one of the prior speakers mentioned. Let me see. Okay, now I can share slides. Perfect. So hopefully you see that. You see my screen. So one of the prior speakers mentioned the fact that it is difficult these days to go and ask for sovereign guarantees in sub-Saharan Africa, and that is for the very good reason that most sub-Saharan African sovereigns, just like most emerging market sovereigns, are incredibly debt constrained. To focus your attention on the debt crisis part of the triple crisis, you're quite familiar already with biodiversity and climate, and the other part of the trifecta is the debt crisis that many are experiencing, especially again in sub-Saharan Africa. It's unbelievable, but the average sovereign is paying effectively market interest rates today that are 10 percentage points higher than already high US rate. So we're talking about average rates, right? Not the highest, but average rates somewhere in the 15% range. And that is just a staggeringly high amount. I looked up Senegal, which is actually better than the average, but it sort of shows you that the host nation, for example, back in 21, so not very long time ago, floated one of their Eurobond series, and at the time the coupon was 5% or so. Now, you know, that very same bond in euros is yielding 10%. And so, you know, something must be done, right, to unlock funding for biodiversity, including water projects, sustainable water projects. And so at the Nature Conservancy, we basically repurposed the pre-existing strategy from the early 90s called Debt for Nature swaps, which back in the day were done on a bilateral basis. And now we're harnessing the power of international capital markets to do these transactions at a much larger scale. They basically have three main pillars. One is ambitious conservation commitments. So that could be in line with the global 30 by 30 movement, and of course with the Paris Accord, and we are now on the road to Dubai and the latest COP28. We see nature and climate as two sides of the same coin. The savings from the transaction flow through an independent conservation trust fund, where the government participates, civil society participates, local universities, businesses, etc. on the board. Nobody has control or majority, and the independent staff of the conservation fund basically runs through a series of requests for proposals and then approves projects that are in line with the conservation vision and the conservation commitments. This also addresses concerns around mismanagement of funds, etc. And the actual transaction, right, you know, basically takes advantage of the very same dire situation that I described earlier, because so much of the outstanding commercial debt is trading at a discount, and hence that's why you have these high market rates, or in technical terms, yield to maturity. There is an opportunity to refinance, right, on a commercial basis. I'm not talking about a forced default and restructuring. In fact, these transactions can prevent the type of very painful and prolonged restructurings that are still ongoing in places like Zambia and Ghana. And so on a commercial basis, you have the opportunity then, using credit enhancements, prior speakers very helpfully talked about credit enhancements and blended finance, you know, you refinance pre-existing debt with new lines of credit that are provided on much more affordable terms because of the credit enhancement features. And then the savings, right, get then channeled through this independent conservation fund. So far, TNC in the last few years have managed to complete these pioneering nature bonds, and so far they have been devoted to salt water, not sweet water. But the very same structure can be applied to freshwater conservation and other projects, and we look forward to expanding our program to terrestrial and freshwater conservation in the future. But just focusing, let's say, on Belize, Barbados, and Gabon, which are the last three transactions that we did, those were done in the last 2 years, so they're all quite recent, and you see the very large amounts of conservation wins associated with these projects, and then the large amounts of funding that is underpinning ambitious conservation commitments. Those transactions generated, or you know, $1.2 billion of new funding to refinance an even larger amount of pre-existing debt. Just to draw your attention to our very last project, which was our first in mainland Africa after the Seychelles, we closed this transaction in August in Gabon, and so we refinanced 500 million of their Euro bonds with a new line, which was credit insured by USDFC, a bilateral development agency. As a result of the political risk insurance that we obtained from DFC, the new transaction had a very high investment grade credit rating, much higher than the underlying credit rating of Gabon as the sovereign partner. And that transaction then is allowing Gabon to credibly get on the journey of fully protecting 30% of its ocean and then managing the rest of its marine area. And so how can we then apply these structures to freshwater conservation? Well, I list here on this slide 3 main conditions that need to be present. First and foremost, government ambition and willingness to undertake this journey. And then, of course, the availability of appropriate credit enhancements and the right type of debt that can be picked up and refinanced. And so, I also list some potential outcomes, including protecting rivers, maintaining flowing rivers, or even removing dams where that's appropriate. So I just want to leave you with these messages, and we're very excited to be on this journey and to find other allies and on the path of protecting fresh waters and the very rich biodiversity of Africa, including working with many in the room, such as the African Development Bank. So I'll stop sharing right now and look forward to our open discussion.
Thank you very much. Particularly interesting to have a mechanism which can answer this question of debt burden, which is rising in the current challenging macroeconomic and financial context. So thank you very much for your intervention. I would like now to open the floor to questions or comments from the audience. So participants in the room or online, if you have questions or comments, this is the moment. Do ideas and presentation from panelists reflect your experience? Do you have other opinion or insights to share? So I see a few questions. Nick Epworth and the gentleman there just in front of the screen, and Katarina Fonseca.
Yes, I come from Uganda. My name is William Mahairwe. I've been in the public sector for a long, long time. And I want to thank you for very well put ideas. I've liked 2 things. There is plenty of money, and I do agree with you. And also many, many projects. I also do agree with you, because I was in the public sector. But there was this big problem of the gestation period. The time it takes for the project, 1, to be planned and be implemented. I've been following the Rwanda project. It took almost 10 to 15 years. And many other projects are taking that long time. How do you address that gestation period? 2, there is this animal that you have not been talking about, and you close it in this name governance, but I think it's more about corruption. How have you addressed that? Have you been faced with such issues, especially people from the private sector? As not only in the public sector, corruption is also in the private sector. How are you addressing that? Now, I got so frustrated in the public sector. I went to the private sector now. And indeed, there's a lot of money, and I have a lot of money to invest. But I have this problem of cost recovery. How sure am I that I'm going to get my money back? Having put, like my friend said, $500 million in Senegal, for raw water. How am I going to get that money back? So from your experience, can you help me on that? I don't know what to do with my money now. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take just the two other questions and then we will ask the panelists to answer. So Nick Epworth, I think you had a question. Or?
Thanks, a great session. Nick Hepworth. I'm from the UK. It's our 30th anniversary of a difficult experiment with private finance in the water sector in the UK. And we're beginning to see that it's something of an unmitigated disaster. We've seen a flight of $100 billion to dividends. There's 76 billion debt. There's an investment shortfall of 71 billion. And our rivers, our quality of rivers is plummeting. Our leakage rates are at 26%, and our water bills have gone up 50% through private equity investment in our water sector. On the other hand, in the Netherlands, where there's a law that restricts private sector involvement in the water sector, some of the cheapest bills in Europe, some of the best water quality, and leakage rates at 5%. So my question is this, polemic or ideological positions aren't going to help us, but where's the evidence base of what works here? And we've heard a lot about de-risking investment for the private sector. How do we de-risk investment for the public, and for the public good? What safeguards are in place to ensure that we don't see the flight of capital out of the sector that we've seen and are hurting from in the UK?
Thank you. And now a last question from Katarina.
Thank you very much, panelists. I think we're talking about public-private partnerships, and there's many different types of PPPs, as panelists have described. We have small, medium, different ecosystems, and then the large PPPs. And I think, we're here having an honest discussion, and I do think it's important to highlight that the financial deals cannot be the end in itself. In the end, we're talking about SDG 6, we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about economies. So in the end, it does have to provide the benefits that it sets out. The water treatment plan in Rwanda, the PPP for Rwanda, in itself, it's a great financial deal for the company. It's amazing advisors. The deal in itself is good. I'm going to read you a quote from the annual audit report of the Office of the Auditor General of Rwanda. Just very brief. So in 2021, WASAC, so the water utility, the fragile water utility that needs to buy the water treated by the water treatment plant at full cost and full capacity. So in 2021, WASAC Limited incurred fixed costs amounting to $3.8 million for 6 million cubic meters of unsupplied water. So the water treatment plant, great PPP, providing water to the water utility, which is not able to use it, and I add here, has 60% non-revenue water, adding to the non-used water treated plant. Additionally, given that the agreement is in USD and Rwanda francs keeps fluctuating, the price of water under this PPP agreement will keep increasing. With the current financial performance, WASAC Limited cannot fully settle Kigali Water Limited's monthly water bills being bailed out by the government. All this to say, in the end, we, the international community, the national governments, the advisors of the national governments, need all to look at the water as the complex system that it is, to be able to provide advice that it brings in more balance, public and private share of risk. And it actually, this finance becomes complementary and not extractive. So just wanted to raise this issue, being it as open as possible. Over to you.
Yeah. So thank you, Katarina and Nick, because you're bringing a question that I wanted to bring to the discussion as per the limits of leveraging private capital for water in Africa. There's for sure scope to do it more effectively. Effectively, it includes this question of doing it well. But it's true that when we speak about water, the private sector cannot realistically be the main financier, and government will always keep playing like the key role. And so there's a question that I have is if we have governments that are very indebted, that have no more funding for water, and that if at the same time the private sector is not the solution, do you think that via the reform of the global financial architecture that is currently being debated, there is here a solution, for instance, regarding reallocation of special drawing rights and the work that the Global Commission on the Economics of Water is currently doing, trying to define the hydrological cycle as a global common good, which is important for our discussion on finance, because currently the debates on the global financial architecture, there are some voices saying that multilateral development banks should finance global common good. So if what the hydrological cycle and water is defined as a global common good, then it means that MDBs will these new financial pockets from MDBs and this question of reallocating SDRs, it will include water. So I think this should be a part of the debate. So I will leave panelists answer the questions. So we have two questions that are a bit similar on the limits of bringing the private sector in water, and another question which is around how do you deal with questions of governance and the long time frame of implementing water projects. And so I don't know if some panelists are willing to answer. So Ernest and Sylvain.
Okay, so a couple of those questions relate to Kigali, which I have the honor of operating now, so I feel like I should answer a couple of those. So to start with the question from the honorable gentleman from Uganda, yes, the plant did take a while to put together, and there's a number of reasons for that. And I think one of the reasons OWID exists is so that we can learn or find a way to circumvent that long process that it took Matito on their own. I think what I would say is that when there are not clearly defined processes with clearly defined people who are responsible, be that at the Line Ministry, at the PPP unit, and at the all the way up to presidential level, that's where there's opportunities for, I guess, entrepreneurial activity, I'll call it, in the system. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do as I go around and have my conversations is find out who is clearly responsible and put as many clear processes around the development of water assets as we can going forward, so that the next projects don't take a decade. Because as has already been said here today, quite frankly, we don't have a decade anymore to take for these processes, and therefore we do need to put solid processes in place, and that's the position we're taking. And that's one of the reasons why Matito got together with British International Investment, who are working on a number of platforms in different sectors, and have learned some things about how to refine those processes. I know it's not perfect, but we're definitely working in that direction. I think on the point of the UK, and as you can hear, I have some experience of the UK, and I would argue there's two things that happened in the UK. One is that regulation wasn't what it should have been, and the plants that were privatized already existed. The situation we have in Africa is that we don't have these plants. And the plants that we need to build and the speed at which we need to build them, it's not going to be possible doing it purely publicly. And I think that's the difference between what happened in the UK. And I would say the lesson I would take to you from the UK for what we're doing in Africa is, as was mentioned earlier by somebody from ESAWAS, I think it's pronounced, the importance of regulation should not be underestimated here. Because I think that's what happened in the UK. There was a failure of regulation. And then on the last point about the position of profitability within KWL, I clearly can't discuss that in detail. I think it's important to say that I think there are a number of network externalities in the water sector that I've seen. I think that I was living in Kenya until very recently, and the water we get from the utility was very cheap, but it didn't come very often. So when we called the water tanker, the price of that water tanker is extremely high, far higher than anything I could even imagine to charge. So clearly there's some network externalities that have not been managed here. And I think that's where I think the question is, where is the value in water? We all know there's value in water, but the question is, where is it? Who's taking it? Why are they taking it? And those are the hard questions we now need to ask ourselves. You could say that Kigali water is expensive or it's US dollar denominated and that kind of thing. But you know, there are a lot of the equipment came from outside Rwanda, which is why unfortunately it had to be bought in US dollars. But I would say that there is huge value in water, but it's not being correctly allocated. And that's what needs to be looked at, because what we require to build these plants and high quality plants that provide high quality water that can be drank from the tap, things we take for granted in Europe, that does require an investment. And I think Africans deserve to have water like that. And therefore, what's it going to cost and why do we need to do it? I think it doesn't need to be said. I think what needs to be said is, where is the value and how do we capture the value in the right place such that these plants can get built?
Thank you, Ernest. I think Sylvain had something to say as well.
Yes, I would like to address the issue raised by a gentleman from Uganda. The question is regarding to the timeline of the project. Si moi je dois revenir sur ce que nous avons fait au Bénin, je vais qu'il prenne son casque. Comme je le disais, le gros raccourci aujourd'hui, parce qu'il faut quand même que les gouvernements prennent leurs responsabilités. Parce que le fait d'accélérer le développement des infrastructures, c'est une responsabilité gouvernementale. En fonction, même si l'argent peut venir soit des multilatérales, venir des bilatérales, venir du secteur privé. Donc il faut préparer le terrain. Ce qu'on a fait dans le rural, comme je le disais, où en 4 ans, on est passé de 42% à pratiquement 80% de taux de desserte, par d'un travail de fond où le gouvernement se dote clairement d'une stratégie qui est claire, d'un schéma directeur d'investissement avec des projets dont toutes les études ont été préparées. Donc il ne faut pas attendre qu'un bailleur ou bien un financier ou bien le secteur privé arrive avant de commencer par faire préparer les études des projets. Tout a été préparé. On a pratiquement 614 études techniques de 614 systèmes préparés. Okay? Une fois que tout ça c'est fait et qu'il y a une institution qui est responsable de la gestion du développement de ces infrastructures, avec les dispositifs mis en place, on peut mobiliser énormément de l'argent. Le programme d'investissement du rural au Bénin coûte à peu près 1,6 milliard de dollars. 1,6 milliard de dollars. Mais en 5 ans, nous avons mobilisé 800 millions de dollars du budget national, avec l'instrument dont j'ai évoqué de la Banque mondiale, qui n'est pas un instrument qui finance des investissements directement, mais qui finance un ensemble de réformes basées sur des résultats. Et quand les résultats sont atteints par le gouvernement, le financement arrive. Ça permet d'apporter une réponse à la question que vous avez posée. En 4 ans, 5 ans, on a fait accroître les taux de décès très rapidement. Donc on n'a pas attendu de négocier des projets, d'avoir un partenaire avant de commencer par faire des... On est prêt. Aujourd'hui, si vous arrivez au Bénin aujourd'hui, avec 100 millions, 200 millions de dollars, 300 millions de dollars, en 2-3 semaines, on vous sort un projet. Les études sont prêtes, et on va en procurement, et on commence le travail. Donc ça veut dire que les pays doivent s'apprêter, tant au plan institutionnel, tant au plan de la stratégie, tant au plan des projets, et sur la base du dispositif institutionnel, donc mobiliser les fonds pour pouvoir développer les projets. J'irai encore plus loin. Ce qui accélère un peu la chose, c'est que tous ces ouvrages qui sont produits sont jetés dans un contexte de durabilité. L'entièreté du pays a été affermée. Les opérateurs privés que nous avons recrutés après pratiquement 3 de transactions PPP, on a clôturé la transaction au plan commercial, au plan financier en 3 ans. Ça a pris énormément de temps. Mais une fois qu'ils sont recrutés en tant que fermiers pour pouvoir maintenir et exploiter les équipements et fournir du service, avec des contrats de 10 ans, tous les ouvrages que nous construisons sont transférés à l'opérateur pour être mis en service immédiatement au service des populations. Donc tout ça fait qu'on a raccourci le temps de développement des infrastructures. Les infrastructures développées sont mises dans un contexte de gouvernance avec des opérateurs qui couvrent l'entièreté du pays, avec un tarif unique, qui aujourd'hui sont des tarifs qui font que certaines populations ont vu leur tarif d'accès à l'eau divisé par 2 ou par 3. Le tarif de l'eau a été divisé par 2 ou par 3 pour certaines contrées. Donc ça veut dire qu'il ne faut pas voir le sujet comme simplement un sujet de financement. Il faut que c'est un dispositif global qui touche la gouvernance, comme je l'ai dit, donc je l'ai expliqué, c'est les institutions, qui touche le mode de délivrance, qui touche la tarification, qui touche la durabilité. Et tout ça, je pense que les multilatérales ont un rôle important à jouer, que de financer simplement des projets d'infrastructure, mais que les pays s'apprêtent avec des dispositifs clairs, avec des stratégies claires, de se faire accompagner par les partenaires, que ce soit privés ou multilatéraux, sur des résultats concrets qui font que ce n'est pas simplement de la finance. Il faut qu'il y ait une intelligence derrière. Vous avez soulevé également une question qui touche, bon, on a parlé de gouvernement, on n'a pas parlé de corruption. Bon, la corruption, ce n'est pas seulement dans le secteur de l'eau, c'est un mal qui est dans tous les secteurs. Et je pense que ça aussi, c'est la façon dont les pays s'arrangent. Est-ce qu'on peut éliminer la corruption? Non, mais on peut décourager la corruption. C'est-à-dire que si des cas sont avérés et qu'on tombe sur ces cas, la façon dont on les traite doit pouvoir décourager les gens. Moi, je peux vous raconter l'histoire de mon pays il y a quelques années, il y a 5 ans, 6 ans. Il y a eu un très gros scandale financier qui a touché le secteur, qui a fait beaucoup de dégâts. On a changé de gouvernement. Le nouveau gouvernement qui est arrivé depuis 7 ans, 6 ans, a introduit un certain nombre de mesures qui font que les partenaires qui ont été même victimes de ces financements ont redonné crédibilité à l'action publique et en revenant avec des montants très importants. Donc tout dépend de comment on traite les cas de corruption. On ne peut pas éliminer la corruption, mais s'il y a une corruption, comment on traite? Si on est complaisant, ça veut dire qu'il y a un problème. Mais si on n'est pas complaisant, que quelqu'un est pris en misprocurement ou bien en détournement et que la sanction est très forte, ça pourrait avoir des effets qui découragent ceux qui ont peut-être des intentions de... Je vous ai donné les montants que nous manipulons aujourd'hui. C'est des montants très importants avec des contrats très serrés. Les opérateurs, les contrats, il n'y a pas de tout. C'est des contrats autorégulés. Dans le contrat, ils se font payer leur tarif exploitant. Le reste part en redevance. Chaque année, on traite des flux financiers audités et qui sont déposés à la caisse de dépôt et de consignation. Donc, quand les règles sont claires et que le contrôle est assez strict, ça limite les risques de corruption. C'est ce que je peux dire.
Merci beaucoup, Sylvain, pour ces éléments sur la gouvernance et des exemples concrets que le gouvernement du Bénin auquel il a pu être confronté. So before we conclude, we have to do 3 things very briefly. I'd like to just ask one online question. There are a few, but we'll take one. It's for Wanjiru, and after that, Babacar and Fatoumata would like to say one final word. So, Wanjiru referred to innovative solutions for water services providers in the area of non-revenue water. Are these all about technical means of improving metering and revenue collection? How do you ensure that solutions adhere to the human right to water?
Yeah, that's quite correct. It's that we are trying to employ or use tech as the enabler that it is in tracking non-revenue water to minimize it, so that they sort of detect where the leak is and sort of fix it as fast as possible. I didn't quite understand the question around touching on the human aspect that I didn't get.
The idea is you mentioned non-revenue water and innovative solutions to decrease non-revenue water. So what did you mean? And then the question is, how do you ensure that solutions adhere to the human right to water? I think it's a similar debate that we are having, that if private equity starts financing access to drinking water, then can you mention, obviously you have this question of bankability, but the big question is then how do you make sure your projects are beneficial to populations?
I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to solve is the fact that, for instance, the WSP, the water service provider, cannot cover their costs. So there's currently, people have to pay for water, unfortunately, because it comes at a cost. The challenge is that the water service providers are bleeding by people not paying for the water. So we try, of course, to adhere to humane standards, but it's more about how can we locate those that are not paying, and then what happens then. And just to curb those losses. We haven't come across a case where it has sort of been not done above board, more because we employ very strict social standards in the companies that we invest in. So that is one of the things we really try to ensure that happens, that any kind of investment we make is very responsible, and we actually have a team that we place in those particular companies to check the social aspects, be it both on the employment side and on the customer service side.
Okay, thank you, Vanjo. So now, one final word from Babacar and then Fatoumata, very briefly, if you can.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to highlight, to emphasize on the fact that several questions that had been raised can be summarized on the limits of leveraging on private sector to finance the water sector. And also to say that leveraging on private finance is not a magical solution, actually. It's just a solution. And as any solution, you have pros and cons. The first pros is that our government, African governments, they have huge concerns on their budget. If you look at African population, in Senegal, for instance, you have a growth rate of 2.7% per year. And every 7 years, you have roughly 20% growth in the population. And in 10 years, you have 30% growth. And most of the time, the budget is not going as far as the population needs. So you need just to have an alternative solution to just finance the basic needs of population. And private sector can be one solution for that. But at the same time, you have the risk. The risk is that private guys also, they will want to maximize their profits. That's the normal, is the mindset of the private sector. So what I wanted to highlight in relation with the topics of this panel is that preparation can be key to address several questions that had been raised. For instance, people say that PPP, some people say PPP is not only public-private partnership. It is prepare, prepare, and prepare. So PPP has to be prepared. It's a very complex transaction, a very complex operation. And I think that governments can set up project preparation facilities with funds from the government for, I don't know, local institutions, instead of just waiting for the FIs to come and to provide grants on subsidies and to ask for helps, and this take time and a very complex procedure. I think that government can try, it can be a best practice to say, okay, you know what, we need to have locally a fund dedicated for project preparation, and also we need to have staff, people dedicated to such kind of projects, so that they can sharpen their skills by repeating again and again and again this project preparation cycle and negotiation with the private sector. Because even based on our experience, the first PPP, for sure, you cannot be very, very good on that. In the first PPP, you will negotiate with guys who are you have all the skills they need in the private sector, and you have to learn by doing. But at the same time, if the government is not capitalizing on the skills to have local teams dedicated for that, and that are sharpening their skills cycle after cycle, so that they can be able later on to negotiate very complex transactions and to maximize, to defend the interests of the government and to maximize the impact of the project for the government. If you don't do that, we will never use at the maximum potential of these new tools that is leveraging on the private sector. So it was something I wanted to highlight, and I think that DFIs who are here in the room, maybe instead of scattering the helps or the subsidies to the government, maybe they can just have a common basket and to try to make capacity building for the government, to help them to set out project preparation funds or facility, help them to set out dedicated teams on PPPs and project preparation, so that in the long term, this country will be able to negotiate very, very successful PPPs and leverage on the maximum on the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Babacar. Very interesting perspective on the limits of leveraging private finance and how governments can actually address some of these issues. So now, Fatoumata for a final word.
Thank you. I wouldn't say it better, actually. I was, when I was listening to the Rwanda and Benin, about the vision of Benin, and then the fact that even us, when we are negotiating and discussing with the public authorities, sometimes we don't have one key focal point. It's not well structured, it's not well organized. So the transaction cost at the end of the day will be high because you'll have a lot of back and forth. So the political willingness, it's key. The political willingness, the political commitment is key. It will, I think, help reduce those transaction costs. And as you said, learn by doing also, because the level of the debt on the public sector is quite huge. We need private sector. I think my colleague Nawal was last week at a conference in Addis Ababa. He told me that there was like more than 20 ministers of finance that were gathering there, discussing about water and how to unlock private sector financing also. So everybody agree on the fact that we need to have the private sector. So now, learn by doing. As a DFI, we also have to support with the World Bank, to support the authorities with capacity building, with transaction, supporting them with access to transaction advisor so that they have the right skill on the negotiation with the private sector. And actually we're doing that, but we need to do it maybe more strongly, more frequently, and I think we're in it already. We have to get there. So we need together, collectively, it's a collective effort we have to put all together and get there. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you very much, Fatoumata. So thank you all the panelists, the audience. That was a very interesting discussion on how we can effectively mobilize private sector for water. When I say effectively, is trying obviously to frame it in the keeping in mind that water should be considered as a global common good according to the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, and that then the way we include the private sector in financing water, it has to be very structured, and governments have a big role to play here. So thank you very much for being here for this very interesting panel. It was a very diverse panel, so I'm very grateful for this. Now I will leave you go take a coffee because we have the Minister Boake Fofana, who will be there at 4 p.m. to deliver a keynote address. So it leaves you 20 minutes for break, coffee, tea. And please be back in the room 5 minutes before so that we are all here when Minister is here. Thank you.